Chapter 9. Crashing down the growth-entangled ridge above the anvil, taking care only that his mount didn't plunge headlong, Chad Hanlon paid no heed to the flight of his confederate. He had forgotten Ep, his dirt and thoughts centered on himself. It had been a shock when Chip Connor burst upon him. The puncher's slug had torn the back of his hand, and Hanlon's first thought, in the midst of the confusion, had been that it was a trap, the very opposite to what he had designed. The truth was that the man, outwardly arrogant, had a secret dread of confronting his enemies through the gun smoke. Fear which he couldn't control sent him racing through the hampered pine scrub and down timber. And 20 minutes later, not without crafty intent, Chad had worked roughly in the direction of the HM, and for what he planned next, he wanted no company. He thrust on steadily, keeping to the cover of low ground, his haste curbed only by the need of saving his horse for any appearance of hard driving. Within an hour he drew near the HM headquarters, and now wariness controlled his movements. The HM was a sprawling cabin-style establishment of log construction, situated comfortably at the back of the pine-scattered bench, looking out over the vast, outspread cattle range and desert tumbling away below, growing hazy and deceptive, till it rose again to the blue mesas and spurs and ranges beyond. The McLennan Holdings was the largest in the Cumbrellas, rivaled only by Nebraska's Swangle's huge Block S to the south. The brand supported a crew of 25 or 30 men, and Chad Hanlon had no wish of meeting any of them. He had in his favor the fact that the winter range lay below in the Arapaho country. He had already seen 2 or 3 small crews riding that way. More followed, and Chad shrewdly guessed that there was something afoot down in the rim rock this morning. He knew what it must be. Keeping well up on the high shoulders back in the ranch, and avoiding the thin trails up there, he came out onto a granite spur which looked down on the spreading tangle of corrals and outbuildings. Alertness tightened even as he passed there. A bright girlish figure ran across the yard with the big flat-roofed house. Though she was tiny at that distance, Chad had no difficulty in recognizing Marion. She disappeared into a log barn, emerging through the back, and apparently spoke to a man working about the corrals. This man obligingly snaked the pony out of the number moving about the corral, but the girl herself was who swung up her saddle with deft ease, secured it, and then slipping on the bridle. Hanlon watched her mount with a leap, subduing the salty animal and go bounding out towards the open with the swooping grace of a swallow. Chad bit his lip with vexation at the direction she was appeared to be taken. She seemed bound for the lower range, but reaching the far edge of the bench, she drew rein and sat her rearing horse and looking out across the open country for a moment, and then she turned the horse back. The man was sure now the girl was heading for the pines. Not for nothing had he studied Marion's movements in the past. Instinct told him the way that she would take, and starting that way, he pulled back into the trees, crowding his horse to a hasty run. Circling the shoulder, regardless of obstructed growth as he crashed through, he dropped down a canyon side and began pushing through the pines. A mile further on, caution descended upon him. At the edge of an open park, he hauled in, narrowly watching its upper end. It was 5 minutes before the girl appeared there, and Chad boldly pushed out of the trees and rode forward, quite as if this meeting was purely by accident. He saw Marion draw out of sight of him, her horse dancing. And then she came on slowly, her face remote and sober. They met at the edge of the pines, whose lacy shadows patterned the thin grass, and Chad touched his hat with a faint smile. "Fancy meeting you," he dropped, fruitily studying her. "Odd, isn't it, on H&M range like this?" she returned coldly. Despite the finality of her words at their last meeting, however, she had her own reasons for not avoiding a further talk with him. Hanlon offered no excuse for his presence here. She knew his mind. An air of respectful defiance was all he revealed as he waited for her to speak. "I understand you've sold the anvil at last," she opened up directly. He knew better than to invite fireworks on this touchy subject. Sold my ranch? No, Marion, he countered easily. It was the last reply that she'd expected, her eyes widening slightly, then narrowed. But Mr. Stevens said... She stopped in momentary confusion, not having planned to admit her visit to the anvil. Chad was smiling at her. Looking for me? Sorry I wasn't there, he murmured. But Mr. Stevens was. She caught herself up sharply. What was he doing there, might I ask? Well, I don't know what Stevens might have said, he threw indifferently into his tone. I happen to have leased the place to him. Subject to my approval, of course. I'm beginning to wonder if it wasn't a mistake, he added thoughtfully. Marion watched him uncertainly and then looked away. If this was true, there might still yet be hope to possess the anvil. An echo of Pat Stevens' dry words came to her mind unabated. Hanlon talks. That Laxton man had drawled out. Whatever he says, he's sold out. Recalling that forthwith statement, the girl did not know what to think. I want the truth, Chad. She gave him a level glimpse of those frank blue eyes which long tormented him. You aren't bitter? You didn't sell in retaliation that day in Alcastre after I... Oh, good Lord, Marion. Hanlon was beside himself. Surely you know me better than that. That whip made me hot for a while, I'll allow that, but not that hot. He seemed hurt. You asked me time and again to sell you the anvil. I've already told you it's yours. I don't want it that way. Her composed face had grown cold. A keener observer than Hanlon would have appalled at the boredom that was revealed there. Marion had honestly detested the man from their first meeting. Attacked alone, an almost hopeless hope that she might hold him at arm's length without antagonizing, had persuaded her to tolerate his unwelcome advances. Chad could not perceive it, infatuated by his own desires. Why not? He pressed close persuasively. You ought to know by now that my every move is in your own interest. Why, Marion... How long is the lease for? She interrupted, turning her horse, as if the space she kept between them was accidental. Well, it was optional, he returned impatiently. I can claim possession again whenever I want. Hang it, don't be stubborn, he burst out. Stevens won't stand in my way. The man's got money. He'll build the place up for us, and we'll be better off when we stock feeders and build our own herd. He was edging still closer. No, Chad, she said abruptly, shaking her head. Don't try and deceive me now. I don't believe you hold any further interest in the anvil. No? That only shows you don't savvy me very well. He laughed jarringly. Why, matter of fact, I'm carrying the deed to the place right now. He briefly displayed the document that was tucked away in his jacket. Marion, why don't you put an end to all this foolishness? He was unconsciously pleading now. It's asking a good deal of a man to lay a quirt to him in public. I'm patient, God knows, but I've had enough of female tantrums. His tone firm. I want to start living and taking care of you. Strong feeling roughened his careful language as persuasion gave way to ungovernable impulse. Chad had crowded the girl hard, striving to get his arm around those stifly small shoulders. What she might attempt now in the way of violence didn't bother him. So far away from prying eyes, he was sure of his mastery. Unable to jump her horse away, her body tight with distaste, Marion struck blindly at his smug face. Chad fended off the blow with a husky laugh. He was ready to close in, almost reach out to haul her out against him, when a movement in the trees directly across the narrow park arrested his glance. It knifed through him with blazing suddenness that they were being spied upon. By whom he didn't know. Such a loutish ranch hand likely. His movement froze, and the girl thrust away from him, startled eyes fixed upon his frowning face. Again Chad caught the flick of movement amongst the trees, and with a snarl of wrath at being thus balked upon at a critical movement, he rammed his horse forward. and to his amazement, a rider had suddenly detached himself from the wall of pines yonder and came hurtling directly towards him. It was Chip Connor, and as they drew together, the puncher stood up in the stirrups and launched himself squarely through the air and with cold ferocity. He hit Hanlon squarely, knocking him out of the saddle, and landed spread eagle on the other's chest as Hanlon thumped the ground on his back. Momentum tumbled them over, and with a roar, Hanlon rose to his knees to plunge at Chip, and this time he landed upmost. He was the heavier man, and for a moment, with fiercely thrust palm, he ground Connor's face sideways into the dirt, and then Chip's knee gouged into his groin. A spasm crossed his face, and breath whistling through his teeth, he rolled away to stumble up and bent over in pain. Smaller and quicker, Connor found his feet and bound after him. A swinging fist smashed into Hanlon's corded face, and Chad, blocking the next, rammed into Chip with a grunt. They traded punches, standing toe to toe, and it was Hanlon who gave ground first, as blow after stinging blow thudded into his numbing midriff. A demon of vengeance appeared to inform Connor's lithe, whip-hardened frame. After what had passed today, he knew this man would not scruple to kill him. And, though the other held the advantage of bulk by a good 20 pounds, there was no question of who had to win this fight. "Stand up and take it!" Chip lashed out savagely. "You're long overdue for it." Chad charged, striving to grapple. For a straining interval they struggled, wrapped in fierce combat, and then Connor kicked wildly at the stocky legs, endeavouring to intertwine with his own. And Chad bawled in desperation. He tried to gouge. The punter got his head away in time. His vicious swing tore Chad's ear and threw him back. Low, cunning glinted, and Hanlon slit his eyes as he came to a stand. Suddenly he crouched, snatching up a rock the size of his two fists, and he hurled it. And Connor dodged. He ran in, and again they swung bitterly, exchanging sledge-like punches. Chip's face was scored and streaked with bloody ground and dirt. His shirt was torn, one sleeve fluttering. Chad was brutally marked. His ear was swelling, one temple darkly bruised, and blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. Range life had not hardened and toughened him as it had Chip Connor. He was beginning to wear down, his barrel chest heaving. Every swing fetching a deep grunt of effort out of him, and the swings were coming slower, with less force behind them. He realized his dilemma. He bore in and flung a gorilla hug round about Connor's waist, and weathered the rain of punishing blows that fell on his face. He attempted to lift Chip bodily. His desperate purpose was to hurl his foe smashing to the ground. It failed to success, however. Chip's leg curled round him, climbing his trunk, the blunt spurs raking his flesh. Staggering and helpless as though he had come to grips with a bobcat, his strength running out, Hanlon slumped, still seeking to drag his adversary down. The puncher let himself off, much as if leaping the back of a horse. He whirled on his toes, and Chad lunged up to meet him. Smack! A clean blow, meaty and loud, in the dreaming quiet of the park, caught Hanlon high on the cheek and tumbled him headlong. He floundered up. His blurring gaze fell upon the fallen six-gun laying a few feet from him. He plunged at it, face murderous, and Chip ground his fingers into the dirt with a boot. And with a strangled yell, Hanlon grovelled over the firearm. Connor promptly whipped it out from under him, grasping it by the barrel, and for an instant the butt hovered in the air above Hanlon's head. But Connor never launched that finishing blow. His arm dropped to his side. His lips twisted contemptuously, and he stepped back. "You rotten louse! You'll have me fighting your style next." Hanlon wavered in his knees, hugging his crushed fingers. His heavy eyes held death. Chip watched him narrowly, poised to explode into action. "Well, do you want some more?" Chad strove to reach his feet, but couldn't make it. His groan was tragic. Snorting, Connor placed a foot against his chest and tumbled him over. The beaten man lay there, sucking in air with long, rasping sobs. "No doubt you're sufficiently proud of yourself by now." The low words were perfectly audible and bitterly cutting. Connor spun on his heel. Marion McLennan took him from top to toe, and her expression said that she found nothing attractive there. "But, dang it, Marion, that skunk was roughing you up. Or at least trying to." Chip halted, flushing, unsure of how far he should go, disastrously aware that it was already too late to draw back. "Oh, and you took care to assure yourself of that?" Her tone dripping scorn. "What else will you have to tell when you relate your conquest?" Abashed by her anger, Chip fumbled helplessly for words. Despite her habitual tartness, the scathing acid of her pride, he had long been secretly convinced that Marion was not really like this at all. It was bitterly distressing to hope for friendship from her and receive a blow, but he'd not beg. "I didn't see a thing, if that's what you mean," he got out slowly. "Reckon I stopped Hanlon before he got too far." "Very thoughtful, of course." Her next words came out with a rush. "What are you doing on this range?" Chip stiffened, his lean face inscrutable. "Sorry, ma'am. I'll be going now." She was before him when he turned away. "Wait." Her tone was impervious. "How long have you thought it necessary to fight my battles? Or wasn't that it? What were you doing here? Or why aren't you answering questions?" He looked at her dumbly, his headshake barely perceptible. Anger made her clean-cut features more determined as she met his look. She grasped his arm, blocking his attempt to push back. "Answer me, Chip Connors!" she cried. Brusquely, the puncher jerked free. His face was closed. Without a glance for Hanlon, still laying where he had fallen, he walked to his horse. He swung up, turned the horse, an unemotional glance toward Marion McLennan's face briefly, then rode in amongst the trees. Too late the girl realized her loss of this excellent source of information concerning Pat Stevens. She had seen Connor in Pat's company at the anvil, and the puncher could catch fire easily, as she had just seen. But it would not even occur to her that, once persuaded to speak, she need ever doubt his word. "Chip!" she called. It was a different tone from the one she had used in her determination to bring him to heel. There was in it a note of supplication, almost a panic. If Connor heard, he chose to make no acknowledgment. But his face was unwontedly long, under the bruises and dirt, as he turned away from the H&M without so much as a backward look. He was far from pleased with this morning's work, rough as it had been. It had only left him, as the issue proved, further from his desire. Chip had long been friends with Marion, if only casually, but now it appeared he was still further away from any more satisfactory relationship. He thought he understood the reason. She had heard that foolishness of Ace Cangle about his having been caught beef in H&M stock, a totally groundless charge levelled with a malice afterthought, but would Marion be apt to equate into the motive for it, when Connor himself wasn't even sure? No wonder she asked accusingly what he was even doing on her range. "Be a long while before she catches me there again," he brooded darkly, confident in this hour that he meant it. His troubles faded from his mind as he drew nearer to the anvil. He had ignored Epstack 2 hours ago when he set himself to trace Chad Hanlon's devious course to the McLennan spread, but the gnarled little man was very much alive in his thoughts as he neared the spot where Stack had last been seen. No ambush had greeted him as he rode down the canyon and saw the anvil house dozing in the sun. A man ran across the yard as Chip broke from the trees, and another called out harshly from the rocks beyond the corral. "Haul up there till we look you over." It was Ezra. The puncher called to him, and a moment later Pat and the others were facing Connor in the yards. "What happened to you?" Ash Salmon inquired, examining his battered face. "Been wrestling with a cougar, or did your girl get mad?" Chip swept them all with a coolie derisive glance. "I've been squaring matters with Hanlon for that shooting he was handing you this morning. What have you been doing?" "Hanlon?" It was a wrathful snort. "How do you know it was Hanlon?" Sam demanded skeptically. "It was him, all right. Him and that sour apple Ep Stack." Chip told him how he had ridden to the H&M line camp and came across Chad and his satellite there. He had stood watch all night only to trace the pair back here. "Well, then it was you that broke that shooting party up," Ollie Whitten exclaimed. "Thought it ended mighty sudden. We got up there in the rocks afterwards and there wasn't a soul around." "Good reason for that. I fogged them through the woods and only caught up Hanlon way over on the H&M again." He related how he'd sailed into Hanlon and given him the whipping of a lifetime. Pat had listened to his story in silence, and he spoke up now. "You laid out all night and watched, without a bite?" His scrutiny was shrewd. "Come on to the house, Chip. We'll feed your face and patch up a few of those scratches." They trooped inside, and Connor, while he wolfed down enough food to make up for the meals he missed, satisfied their curiosity about many details of the morning's adventure. "So there's no doubt about it being Hanlon who's tied up to make it hot for us this morning," Pat mused as they talked it over. "That only confirms what you once said there, Ezra. Chad doesn't intend to give up the place. He hopes to discourage me and drive me off." "Well, you can put a stop to that game pretty darn quick," growled the big man. "Just let me handle that job." "No, I want him to have plenty of rope." Pat's tone was decided. "His kind always hang themselves sooner or later. Not that I don't anticipate Chip's taking a hand this morning," he went on quickly. "Hanlon and Stack had us pinned in here with our hands tied. They could have kept up here all day. Someone would have been killed." "There sure would have been if I had a clean bead up there in the rocks," Chip exclaimed warmly. "As it is, Chad'll think twice before he decides to play rough again, if he ever feels up to her." As the fact became out in the discussion, Connor expressed amazement at the manner in which the ranch deed had been lifted from Pat's room in town. "Hanlon's got it, I'm almost certain of it. I saw him show Marion some kind of paper. If I'd have known what it was, I'd have half killed that slick wolf. Damn it, Stevens, if you'd only told me this before." "Now we know Hanlon's got it," Ezra suggested coolly. "Why don't we just corner the coyote and take it off him?" Pat opened his lips to speak, but turning to the door, as a rapid clip-clop of hooves came to his ears, making a sign, he stepped outside. He was not greatly surprised when Marion McLennan pulled up a dozen feet from the porch and nodded to him distantly. "Howdy, ma'am." Her glance took in Ezra and Sam Salone standing in the door behind him, and then she turned to watch Josh Salmon and Whitten roughing out some unbroken horses in the corrals with Nico Santos. "Quite a crew, Mr. Stevens," she said plainly. "More than one would expect to find on a ranch of this size. Are these men," she went on colorlessly, "who helped you stampede H.M. stock into the Guatemaro Rim Rock sometime during the last few days, so that my steers have wandered miles down into the canyons?" End of chapter 9.